They call themselves the descendants of the ancient Israelites, a people chosen, scattered, and forgotten. To some, they are reclaiming a lost heritage. To others, they are rewriting history. But behind the controversy lies a story far deeper than headlines, a story that spans continents, centuries, and cultures. This is the story of the Black Israelites, a movement rooted in faith, identity, and the struggle for belonging. The origins of the Black Israelite belief can be traced back to the late 19th century in America, a time when African Americans were searching for answers about who they truly were, stripped of their languages, cultures, and ancestral ties by centuries of slavery. Many Black men and women looked to the Bible for identity and empowerment. They saw in the suffering of the Israelites, exiled, enslaved, and scattered across the earth, a reflection of their own history in America. Early leaders, like William Saunders Crowdy, a former slave turned preacher, claimed divine visions revealed to him that African Americans were the true descendants of the biblical Israelites. His followers formed congregations, adopting Hebrew names, dietary laws, and traditions they believed reconnected them to their lost heritage. For many, it wasn't just religion, it was restoration. Throughout the 20th century, the movement spread into different branches and interpretations. Some groups emphasized strict adherence to Old Testament laws, wearing fringes and garments described in Scripture, and observing Sabbaths and holy days. Others blended Christianity with Hebraic identity, affirming Jesus as Messiah, but insisting he was a Black man. And as the movement grew, so did its diversity, from small congregations in Harlem to vibrant communities in the Caribbean and Africa. But the heart of the Black Israelite identity has always been rooted in the Bible's prophecies of exile and return. Passages like Deuteronomy 28, which describe a people taken into slavery on ships and scattered to foreign lands, resonated powerfully with descendants of Africans brought to the Americas. To many, it wasn't coincidence, it was confirmation. By the 1960s and 70s, groups like the Israeli School of Universal Practical Knowledge, ISUPK in New York, began to emerge, preaching a militant message of awakening. Street preachers with booming voices declared to passers-by that the so-called African Americans, along with people of Caribbean and Latin American descent, were the true 12 tribes of Israel. Their fiery sermons, often confrontational, unapologetic, and challenging, drew both followers and critics. At the same time, more moderate branches of the movement emphasized community building, health, education, and cultural restoration. Congregations, like the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, even migrated to Israel in the 1960s, where they established settlements and sought recognition as the descendants of ancient Israelites. Today, thousands of Black Israelites live in the Negev desert in Israel, continuing their traditions in what they see as the Promised Land. Yet the story of the Black Israelites is not without controversy. Some groups have been accused of promoting exclusivist or extreme teachings, leading to sensational headlines. But beneath those controversies lies a deeper truth. The movement represents a longing for identity and justice, a reclamation of dignity after centuries of displacement. For many Black Israelites, their heritage is not about hate or exclusion. It's about survival, pride, and spiritual awakening. And whether one agrees with their claims or not, the impact is undeniable. The movement has influenced music, from reggae artists like Bob Marley, who sang of Zion and redemption, to hip-hop artists weaving biblical identity into lyrics. It has shaped communities, offering structure, discipline, and purpose to generations searching for answers. At its core, the story of the Black Israelites is a story of belonging, a people stripped of their history, piecing together fragments of identity through scripture, tradition, and faith. A people who saw themselves not as the bottom of society, but as the children of kings, prophets, and a chosen nation. And it raises a larger question: who gets to write history? Is heritage defined by scholars and records, or by faith and lived experience? The debate continues, but one thing is certain: the Black Israelite movement has carved itself into the cultural and spiritual fabric of the African diaspora. This is more than religion. This is identity. This is memory. This is survival. If we step back from the crowded streets of Harlem, or the congregations of modern Black Israelite communities, we must ask a bigger question: could there be a historical connection between African peoples and the ancient Israelites? This is where faith, oral tradition, and history collide. Across Africa, countless communities have long claimed descent from the Israelites. In West Africa, oral traditions among the Igbo of Nigeria describe themselves as having Jewish or Israelite origins, pointing to customs such as circumcision, dietary practices, and purification rituals that mirror ancient Hebrew law. In Ethiopia, the Beta Israel, often called Ethiopian Jews, preserved biblical traditions for centuries, even before European contact. They kept the Sabbath, observed dietary laws, and carried with them legends of descent from the tribe of Dan. When Africans were uprooted during the transatlantic slave trade, these traditions and memories crossed the ocean as well. Though stripped and suppressed, fragments survived. Spirituals sung in the fields often echoed the Exodus story. "Let my people go," they cried, identifying with the Israelites, fleeing Egypt's bondage. This wasn't coincidence. It was a spiritual memory, preserved in song, faith, and hope. Historians point out that many West African societies shared cultural similarities with biblical practices. The Ashanti, for example, practiced purification rituals reminiscent of Levitical laws. The Yoruba traced descent lines through traditions resembling tribal genealogies. While these links do not serve as definitive proof of Israelite ancestry, they illustrate why the narrative resonated so powerfully with descendants of Africans in the Americas. For enslaved people searching for identity, the story of Israel wasn't foreign, it felt familiar. By the time Black Israelite teachings began to emerge in the late 19th century, this sense of connection found fertile ground. The Bible, already central to African American life through the church, became more than a spiritual text. It became a mirror of identity. To many, it explained their suffering, their displacement, and their resilience. Deuteronomy 28, which speaks of curses that would befall Israel for disobedience, including exile, enslavement, and dispersal to foreign lands, was read not as ancient prophecy alone, but as present reality. For believers, this wasn't allegory, it was history written about them. William Saunders Crowdy, often called a founding figure of the movement, leaned on this interpretation. His visions weren't simply about religious revival, they were about connecting African Americans to a divine heritage that gave meaning to their suffering. His message was radical. You are not just descendants of slaves, you are the chosen people of God. In a society that stripped Black people of dignity and worth, that message electrified hearts and sparked a movement. From there, the Black Israelite identity became a spiritual lifeline. As the 20th century dawned, congregations in cities like Harlem became centers of cultural and religious pride. Hebrew was studied, new names were adopted, traditional biblical festivals like Passover and the Feast of Tabernacles were celebrated alongside African-inspired practices. This wasn't just about reclaiming faith, it was about rewriting identity in a world that denied their humanity. Skeptics questioned the claims, arguing that cultural parallels between Africa and Israel could be coincidental, or the product of widespread biblical influence, rather than genetic lineage. But for the Black Israelite communities, the point wasn't limited to bloodlines. It was about belonging to a sacred narrative that restored dignity. To call oneself Israelite was to say, We are not lost, we are not cursed, we are chosen. This conviction turned Scripture into a weapon of empowerment. The Bible, once used by oppressors to justify chains, became a book of liberation. And in the story of the Israelites, enslaved, scattered, and then restored, the African diaspora found both identity and prophecy. As the movement grew, its message expanded beyond America. In the Caribbean, communities in Jamaica, Trinidad, and Haiti began embracing Israelite identity. In Africa, leaders among the Igbo and Ashanti echoed the same claims. In Ethiopia, the Beta Israel stood as living proof that Israelite traditions could survive in African soil for millennia. For many, this global resonance was itself evidence that the story was true. The scattered tribes of Israel were waking up. Yet this awakening was not without tension. Questions of authenticity, recognition, and legitimacy loomed. Were these communities truly descended from Israelites, or were they adopting an identity born of necessity? Could faith and lived experience rewrite history, or would mainstream scholars always dismiss these claims? Regardless of the answers, one truth became undeniable. The Black Israelite movement tapped into a deep human need, the need to know where you come from. And in that search, millions found not shame, but pride. By the early 20th century, America's cities were swelling with change. The Great Migration was underway. Millions of African Americans were leaving the rural South, seeking work, education, and freedom in northern cities. Harlem, in New York City, became the cultural capital of this new Black identity. Jazz spilling out of clubs, poets reciting words of pride, artists painting visions of freedom. And amid this cultural awakening, the Black Israelite movement began to grow roots. For many African Americans, Harlem was both a promise and a challenge. Yes, it offered opportunity, but it also laid bare the stark realities of racism, poverty, and systemic exclusion. The church had long been a foundation for survival, but some sought something more, an identity that connected them to the ancient world, a story that elevated them beyond America's margins. In Harlem, congregations of Black Israelites began to emerge as that alternative. One of the most notable figures was Rabbi Wentworth Arthur Matthew, a Caribbean immigrant who arrived in New York in the early 20th century. Inspired by the vision of earlier leaders like William Saunders Crowdy, Matthew founded the Commandment Keepers in Harlem in 1919. He taught that African Americans were descendants of the Israelites, and he worked to restore Hebrew traditions among his followers. His synagogue wore prayer shawls, studied Hebrew, observed Sabbath on Saturdays, and celebrated biblical festivals. Rabbi Matthew's influence spread far beyond his congregation. He trained and ordained rabbis who would later establish their own synagogues, ensuring the message would continue to grow. While his version of Israelite identity leaned toward traditional Judaism, emphasizing Hebrew language and rituals, he also grounded his teachings in the reality of Black life in America. For his followers, being an Israelite was not just a matter of faith, it was a way of reclaiming dignity in a world that denied their humanity. At the same time, other congregations began to emerge across Harlem and beyond, each interpreting Israelite identity differently. Some embraced strict biblical laws, others blended Christianity with Hebraic traditions, and some leaned more heavily into prophetic visions. What united them all was a shared belief that Black people were not cursed descendants of Ham, as racist theology had long claimed, but chosen descendants of Israel. This reinterpretation of Scripture was powerful. In a time when mainstream society mocked or dismissed Black people as inferior, the Israelite message declared, "We are God's people. Our story is in the Bible. Our destiny is restoration." For members of the movement, this wasn't theory, it was empowerment. The Harlem congregations also intersected with the broader Black cultural awakening. Poets and musicians in the Harlem Renaissance referenced biblical imagery of exile, captivity, and redemption, themes that echoed deeply with Israelite teachings. Jazz musicians infused spiritual undertones into their music, while writers explored identity, roots, and belonging. In this cultural cauldron, Black Israelite teachings resonated as both religious conviction and cultural pride. As the decades progressed, the movement branched outward. Some groups leaned into traditional religious life, maintaining synagogues, Hebrew classes, and community programs. Others began to adopt more radical and militant approaches, preaching in public squares with fiery rhetoric. Harlem's sidewalks became stages for bold proclamations. "You are not Negroes, you are not slaves, you are the children of Israel." These voices, often amplified through street preaching, reached passers-by who might never have set foot in a synagogue. The diversity of teachings sometimes led to tension. Some Israelites identified closely with mainstream Judaism and sought recognition as Jews. Others rejected any association, insisting that only those descended from the African diaspora were true Israelites. Still others wove Christian elements into their faith, identifying Jesus, or Yahwashi, as some groups called him, as a black Messiah who would return to liberate his people. Despite the differences, the Harlem congregations laid the foundation for the modern movement. They provided structure, ritual, and community. They raised generations of children in Israelite identity, ensuring that the message did not die with a single leader. By the mid-25th century, the seeds planted in Harlem had spread to other cities, Philadelphia, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and beyond. What made Harlem such fertile ground for the movement was not just its cultural vibrancy, but its contradictions. It was a place of pride and poverty, of renaissance and repression, of dreams and disappointments. The Black Israelite identity fit into this landscape perfectly, a faith that embraced struggle but promised destiny. By the 1960s, the echoes of Harlem's Israelites could be heard far beyond the synagogue walls. The civil rights movement was in full swing. Black power was rising. Across America, people were searching for language to describe their oppression and their hope. For many, the story of Israel offered that language. The Israelites of old had faced slavery, exile, and suffering, but they had also been chosen, delivered, and restored. To see oneself in that story was to find meaning in the struggle. And so, Harlem's Israelite communities became more than congregation. They became symbols of resilience, proof that identity could be reclaimed, and that even in the heart of America's racial oppression, a people could rewrite their story. By the 1970s and 80s, the Black Israelite movement had taken on a new face. What began in Harlem synagogues, rooted in study and tradition, began spilling onto the streets in bold and unmistakable ways. For some groups, it was no longer enough to keep their identity contained within temple walls. The world needed to hear the message, loudly and publicly. If you walked through Harlem, Brooklyn, or Philadelphia during these years, you might hear it before you saw it. A booming voice, echoing off buildings. "You are the real Israelites. You are God's chosen people." On the sidewalks, men dressed in robes and fringed garments held Bibles, speaking to crowds. They pointed to Scripture, declaring that African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans were the descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel. For many, this was a revelation. In communities plagued by poverty, police brutality, and systemic racism, the message carried fire. You are not cursed, you are not forgotten, you are chosen. But with that fire came a tone that was increasingly militant. Some groups began to speak not only about identity, but about judgment. They warned of divine wrath on America for its treatment of black people. They spoke of the downfall of oppressors and the restoration of God's people. This public style of preaching began to define a whole new chapter of the movement. While moderate Israelite congregations continued to hold services, teach Hebrew, and quietly build communities. The street-preaching Israelites captured the public eye. Their boldness drew attention, but it also sparked controversy. Part of the divide came down to approach. Leaders like Rabbi Wentworth Matthew and his students had emphasized spiritual discipline, cultural pride, and continuity with Jewish traditions. They saw the movement as a way to restore dignity and faith to their people. But in the streets, groups like the Israelite School of Universal Practical Knowledge, ESUPK, founded in the 1960s, took a harder edge. Their sermons weren't just about identity, they were confrontations. Standing on corners with megaphones, they engaged anyone who passed by. Sometimes their words were inspirational, other times they were confrontational, even harsh. The tone wasn't accidental. Many of these preachers saw themselves as prophets in the wilderness, calling out to a lost people. Just as Isaiah or Jeremiah had warned ancient Israel of judgment, they believed their role was to awaken the modern Israelites, and that required force. In their view, America was Egypt reborn, Babylon reborn, Rome reborn, oppressive empires that had to fall for God's people to rise again. This shift to militancy created friction inside the wider Israelite world. Some congregations feared that the aggressive street preaching would overshadow the quieter work of building community. Others embraced it, believing the boldness was exactly what was needed to shake a people from their sleep. The Black Power era only magnified these dynamics. With the rise of groups like the Nation of Islam and the Panthers, fiery rhetoric and militant pride had become a language of resistance. Black Israelites, especially in their street preaching form, fit into this landscape perfectly. They wore garments styled after biblical descriptions, held banners depicting the 12 tribes, and spoke with conviction that their people were destined for restoration. But militancy had costs. The public confrontations drew criticism from mainstream society. Newspapers often portrayed the groups as extremist. Some Jewish communities, particularly in New York, objected to Israelite claims of being the true Jews, sparking tension and debate. Scholars debated whether the movement was primarily religious, political, or cultural. For many outsiders, it became easier to focus on the harshest rhetoric rather than the diversity of beliefs within the movement. Inside the movement, however, the message kept spreading. Young men and women who felt invisible in America found power in the teachings. To be told, "You are Israel, not a nobody," was transformative. It gave meaning to suffering, and it promised a future of redemption. Whether in synagogues, community centers, or on sidewalks, the Israelite identity became a banner of pride. By the late 20th century, the split between moderate and radical branches was clear. On one side were congregations that sought recognition within Judaism, practicing rituals, studying Hebrew, and building bridges. On the other were militant groups that rejected mainstream acceptance, insisting that the world would never acknowledge them until God Himself restored them. One preached with prayer shawls in synagogues, the other shouted with megaphones in public squares. Yet despite their differences, they were united by the same root, the belief that the descendants of the African diaspora were not cursed slaves, but chosen Israelites. That belief, whether whispered in prayer or shouted on street corners, continued to grow. As the 21st century dawned, cameras and the internet would give these preachers an even bigger stage, and with it, the Black Israelite movement would step into global visibility like never before. When the 21st century arrived, it didn't just bring a new millennium, it brought a revolution in communication. The internet, and later social media, rewired how voices spread, and the Black Israelite movement found itself at the center of this shift. What had once been confined to synagogues, street corners, and local communities suddenly had a global megaphone. In the early 2000s, YouTube became a platform unlike anything before it. For Israelite preachers who had long commanded sidewalks with booming voices, the move online was seamless. Videos of fiery street sermons began appearing, capturing the attention of viewers across the world. What had once been a handful of listeners in Times Square could now be tens of thousands of viewers online. Clips went viral. Some were praised as eye-opening, others were criticized as confrontational, but either way, people were watching. The visuals were unmistakable. Men in robes and fringes, holding Bibles, pointing to banners of the 12 tribes of Israel, each tribe mapped to modern nations and ethnic groups. Their voices were filled with urgency, declaring that African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans were the true descendants of the ancient Israelites. Whether someone agreed or disagreed, the message was impossible to ignore. For the first time, the movement's diversity also became visible on a global stage. Viewers could see not just the militant street preachers, but also the quieter congregations live streaming Sabbath services, teaching Hebrew online, and connecting diaspora communities across continents. Moderate groups used the internet to share prayers, lessons, and music. Militants used it to challenge, provoke, and call out oppression. Together, they painted a picture of a movement that was far from monolithic. The reach extended beyond America. In the Caribbean, congregations in Jamaica, Trinidad, and Haiti posted their own teachings online. In Africa, groups in Nigeria and South Africa embraced the Israelite identity, often blending it with local traditions. Suddenly, what had once been seen as a Harlem-centered identity became a global phenomenon. For believers, this global resonance was evidence of prophecy fulfilled. The scattered tribes were waking up. But the internet also magnified controversy. Viral clips of Israelite preachers shouting at passers-by, sometimes aggressively, circulated widely, leading to headlines that painted the entire movement as extremist. High-profile confrontations, like those involving Israelite groups in Washington, D.C., sparked debates across the media. Were these prophets of truth or purveyors of hate? The answer often depended on which clip people had seen. The digital age also deepened internal divides. Some groups embraced the opportunity to reach a broad audience, polishing their presentations, using graphics, and offering structured lessons. Others doubled down on raw confrontational styles, believing that watering down the message would weaken its power. The result was a spectrum of Israelite content online, from calm Bible study sessions to fiery street confrontations, all claiming to represent the same identity. Yet even with controversy, the impact was undeniable. For many young people searching for identity in a fractured world, stumbling onto an Israelite video could be life-changing. A teenager in Chicago could scroll past a sermon, declaring, "You are not lost, you are Israel." A young man in London might find a live-streamed Sabbath service. A family in Jamaica might connect with believers in New York. The internet became the gathering place of a scattered people. And unlike earlier generations, the digital age provided evidence of scale. Before, someone might hear whispers of Israelites in Harlem or rumors of groups in Philadelphia. Now, a single search could reveal hundreds of congregations, thousands of videos, and millions of views. The sense of being part of something larger, something global, gave believers strength. For outsiders, the digital explosion forced a reckoning. Scholars, journalists, and religious leaders began studying the movement more seriously. No longer able to dismiss it as a fringe curiosity, documentaries, debates, and think pieces appeared, analyzing its theology, its cultural impact, and its controversies. Some portrayed it as dangerous, others saw it as a vital expression of Black identity and empowerment. Either way, the movement was now firmly in public consciousness. The internet did something else too. It blurred the line between religion and entertainment. For some viewers, Israelite videos were consumed like theater, fiery debates, shocking confrontations, and bold proclamations. For believers, they were sacred messages. The dual role of the internet, as both platform for faith and stage for spectacle, shaped the way the movement was seen worldwide. By the 2010s and 2020s, the Black Israelite presence online was unmistakable. Instagram pages shared memes about the 12 tribes. TikTok videos spread teachings in bite-sized form. Twitter debates raged over scripture and identity. The digital battlefield became as important as the physical street corner. And as with so many modern movements, visibility was power. What began as whispered claims in 19th century prayer circles had become a global conversation, with millions of voices engaging, challenging, and amplifying. The Black Israelite identity was no longer hidden, it was broadcast to the world. And for many who heard the call, it was more than history, more than religion, it was destiny. As the Black Israelite movement grew louder and more visible, it also drew sharper criticism. For centuries, African Americans had been denied history, culture, and identity, so reclaiming the biblical narrative as their own was revolutionary. But revolutions always spark resistance, and the Israelite identity became one of the most hotly debated claims in the modern religious world. One of the central controversies has always been legitimacy. Mainstream Judaism, rooted in rabbinic tradition, centuries of diaspora history, and recognition of Jewish communities worldwide, often viewed the Black Israelite claim with skepticism. To many rabbis and scholars, the assertion that African Americans were the true Israelites undermined Jewish continuity and history. They questioned whether there was historical or genetic evidence to support such claims. On the other side, Israelite groups pushed back hard. They argued that legitimacy wasn't about DNA tests or archaeological debates, but about prophecy, faith, and lived experience. For them, the curses described in Deuteronomy 28, exile, enslavement, dispersion among the nations, fit the story of the African diaspora with uncanny accuracy. Mainstream Judaism might dismiss the claim, but for believers, Scripture was proof enough. This created a sharp divide. Some Israelite congregations sought connection with Jewish communities, learning Hebrew, adopting traditional practices, and even pursuing formal conversion to gain recognition. Others rejected the very idea of needing approval, declaring that they were the chosen people, whether the world acknowledged it or not. The result was a movement split between those seeking acceptance and those embracing separation. Christianity posed another layer of tension. Many Israelite groups rejected traditional Christian teachings, arguing that centuries of European influence had distorted the Bible. The image of a white Jesus, they said, was not only inaccurate, but part of a larger system of oppression. Some groups embraced a black Messiah figure, often calling him Yahwashi, who they believed would return to restore his people. For Christians, these teachings were often seen as heretical, creating yet another front of opposition. The controversies didn't stop there. The more militant branches of the movement, especially those that dominated street preaching and viral videos, attracted criticism for their confrontational style. Their fiery condemnations of America, their harsh language toward outsiders, and their uncompromising tone made them targets of media scrutiny. Headlines branded them as extremists. Clips circulated portraying them as hateful. For many outsiders, this became their only exposure to the movement, overshadowing the quieter, more moderate Israelite communities that focused on prayer, family, and faith. Within the movement, debates raged about identity itself. Was being an Israelite a matter of bloodline, faith, or both? Some insisted that only descendants of the African diaspora could be true Israelites, citing prophecy and history. Others took a more inclusive approach, teaching that anyone who embraced the commandments and lived the Israelite way of life, could belong. These internal debates shaped the future of the movement. As different factions carved out their own interpretations, scholars also weighed in, adding another layer of complexity. Some pointed to cultural similarities between African traditions and ancient Israelite practices as evidence of connection. Others argued that the movement was less about historical proof and more about cultural survival, that by identifying as Israelites, African Americans reclaimed dignity, worth, and narrative control in a society that had stripped them of all three. In this view, whether or not the lineage could be proven mattered less than the empowerment it brought. What became clear was that legitimacy, for the Black Israelites, was as much about power as it was about history. To say we are Israel was to flip the script on centuries of oppression. It was to refuse the labels imposed by slavery and racism. It was to write oneself into the divine narrative of the Bible. For believers, that truth could not be erased by scholars, rabbis, or critics. And yet the criticisms continued. Jewish organizations warned against what they saw as historical revisionism. Christian leaders pushed back against teachings that undermined church authority. Media outlets amplified the most controversial voices, painting the entire movement with one brush. To some, Black Israelites were prophets. To others, they were imposters. To still others, they were a cultural phenomenon born of trauma and resilience. In the middle of all this, everyday members of the movement continued their lives, raising families, keeping the Sabbath, celebrating biblical festivals, and teaching their children that they were part of something sacred. For them, legitimacy was not decided in academic debates or newspaper articles. It was decided in the home, the congregation, and the heart. The question of legitimacy may never be fully settled, but what's undeniable is the impact. Whether embraced or rejected, the Black Israelite identity has reshaped how millions of people see themselves, their history, and their destiny. It has forced conversations about race, faith, and identity that reach far beyond synagogue walls or street corners. And as the movement continued to grow into the 21st century, those conversations would only get louder, because in the age of global visibility, the world could no longer ignore the Israelites of Harlem, America, and beyond. Religion is never just about the spiritual. It lives in the world we inhabit. And for the Black Israelite movement, the world has always been political. From its earliest days in Harlem to its fiery presence online today, the Israelite identity has been inseparable from questions of justice, oppression, and liberation. For African Americans, faith has long been a political language. In the days of slavery, spirituals carried coded messages of escape. In the civil rights era, church hymns became protest anthems. For Black Israelites, the Bible itself became a political manifesto, a text that explained their oppression and promised their deliverance. Passages of exile, slavery, and redemption weren't just history. They were a mirror of Black experience in America. This perspective turned scripture into a tool of resistance. When Israelites read Deuteronomy's warnings about bondage in foreign lands, they saw America's plantations. When they read about Babylon's corruption, they saw modern empires. When they read about a chosen people rising again, they saw themselves. The result was a worldview where politics and prophecy blurred, where America wasn't just a nation, but a stage in God's unfolding plan. By the mid-20th century, this worldview collided with broader movements for justice. In Harlem and beyond, Israelite congregations lived alongside the civil rights movement and the rise of Black power. While not always formally connected, their messages ran parallel. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. preached of deliverance from oppression. Groups like the Panthers demanded power and dignity. Black Israelites declared, "We are Israel, and our redemption is coming." Each spoke different languages, but all sought liberation. Some Israelites joined marches and protests, blending faith with activism. Others distanced themselves, believing that true liberation could only come from God, not governments. Yet even in separation, the politics of identity remained central. To declare oneself Israelite was itself a political act, a rejection of the labels, Negro or slave, and an embrace of divine chosenness. As the movement grew, so did its confrontation with America's political system. Militias, police forces, and politicians viewed the more militant groups with suspicion, especially as their rhetoric grew sharper. Public preaching that condemned America as Babylon, that spoke of judgment on oppressors, drew surveillance and criticism. In some cases, law enforcement categorized radical Israelite groups alongside other black nationalist movements, placing them under watch. At the same time, moderate congregations sought recognition rather than confrontation. They petitioned for the right to practice freely, to be acknowledged as legitimate religious communities, and to be included in interfaith dialogues. Their fight was not against America's existence, but against its refusal to see them as equals. In this way, the movement mirrored broader struggles within Black America, some demanding revolution, others demanding recognition. In the 21st century, these dynamics only intensified. Social justice movements, like Black Lives Matter, echoed themes long present in Israelite preaching: systemic oppression, police brutality, the devaluation of Black lives. For Israelites, these weren't just modern issues, they were biblical patterns repeating themselves. The prophets had spoken of a world where God's people would be despised and mistreated. The nightly news seemed to confirm those prophecies. At rallies and protests, Israelite voices sometimes appeared alongside other activists, declaring that the suffering of Black people was not just political but spiritual. In viral videos, street preachers linked police shootings to scripture, reading from the Bible as crowds listened. Their message: the struggle for justice is ancient, and the hope for deliverance is divine. But controversy followed here too. Some critics accused Israelite groups of hijacking political moments for religious ends. Others pointed to their more militant rhetoric as divisive rather than unifying. Within the movement itself, debates flared. Should Israelites ally with broader political causes, or remain separate? Was the path forward through activism, or through faith alone? Despite disagreements, one reality was clear: the Israelite identity carried political weight. It gave language to suffering, it framed oppression within a larger story, and it offered hope when political systems failed. For believers, to wear fringes, to keep Sabbath, to call oneself Israelite, these were not just religious acts. They were statements of resistance against a world that had long denied their humanity. Recognition remained a central struggle. Some groups sought legal acknowledgement as Jewish communities, fighting for inclusion in Jewish institutions and protections. Others rejected that entirely, insisting that recognition from man was irrelevant when they had recognition from God. Both paths reflected the political dimensions of identity. Whether through the courts or the corners, the battle was for dignity, legitimacy, and belonging. The fight for recognition also extended globally. In Africa, Caribbean, and Latin America, Israelite communities sought acknowledgement from governments and religious bodies alike. Some won official status, others remained marginalized. But everywhere, the pattern was the same: a people long denied their history, demanding to be seen, both by nations and by faiths. Politics, for the Black Israelites, has never been just about laws or votes. It has been about survival, about identity, about prophecy. And as the 21st century unfolds, their political voice continues to grow louder in synagogues, on streets, online, and in movements for justice around the world. To an outsider, the Black Israelite movement can look monolithic, men in robes on street corners, preaching with booming voices. But inside the movement, the reality is far more complex. What unites them is the claim to Israelite identity. Beyond that, diversity reigns. At one end of the spectrum are the moderate congregations. These groups often trace their roots back to the Harlem synagogues of the early 20th century. They emphasize spirituality, discipline, and family. Services are held weekly, often resembling traditional Jewish practices, with Torah readings, prayers, and Hebrew study. Children are taught Israelite history alongside math and science, growing up with a sense of rootedness in both their faith and their identity. Moderates often seek bridges with mainstream Judaism. Some pursue formal conversions or partnerships with Jewish institutions. Others argue that conversion is unnecessary because their lineage already connects them to Israel. In either case, their approach tends to be quieter, focused on preserving tradition and building strong communities, rather than confronting outsiders. On the opposite end are the radicals, groups known for fiery street preaching and uncompromising rhetoric. These are the Israelites, most often captured on viral videos, declaring judgment on America, calling out bystanders, and presenting scripture as prophecy unfolding in real time. Their garments, banners, and booming voices create a spectacle designed to shock, awaken, and provoke. For them, boldness is not just a style, it is a divine mandate. Some radicals reject any association with Judaism, claiming that today's Jewish people are imposters who usurp the Israelite identity. Others reject Christianity, denouncing it as a corrupted faith imposed by colonizers. Their focus is often apocalyptic, centered on the belief that divine judgment is near, and that the true Israelites must prepare for restoration. Between these two poles lie countless variations. Some groups blend Christian elements, identifying Jesus, or Yahawashi, as the Messiah who will return to restore Israel. These messianic strands often emphasize prophecy, connecting current events with biblical timelines. Others focus less on end times and more on moral reform, urging members to obey biblical laws on diet, clothing, and conduct. Still others embrace a Pan-African lens, linking Israelite identity with broader struggles across the African diaspora. For them, the movement is not just about religion, but about reclaiming African heritage in all its forms. They draw connections between biblical Israel and ancient African kingdoms, between exile and the transatlantic slave trade, between prophecy and modern politics. Women also play diverse roles across the movement. In some congregations, women serve as leaders, teachers, and organizers, shaping the community's spiritual life. In others, their roles are more restricted, reflecting conservative interpretations of Scripture. This diversity often sparks debate within and between groups, as members wrestle with tradition, modernity, and the balance of gender roles in faith. The diversity also extends to theology. Some groups emphasize strict adherence to Old Testament law, following dietary rules, wearing fringed garments, and observing biblical festivals. Others reinterpret the laws symbolically, focusing on moral lessons rather than literal practice. Still others adapt rituals creatively, blending Israelite traditions with African cultural expressions. This diversity can be both strength and weakness. On one hand, it shows the movement's adaptability, its ability to speak to different contexts, needs, and personalities. On the other, it can fuel fragmentation, as disagreements over theology, practice, or leadership split communities apart. Some groups denounce others as false Israelites, deepening divisions even as they share the same core identity. Despite these differences, a few common threads run through nearly every branch of the movement. The first is identity. Whether moderate or radical, messianic or pan-African, nearly all agree that the descendants of the African diaspora are part of the ancient Israelites. This shared conviction provides the foundation upon which all else is built. The second is resistance. From its earliest days, the movement has been a form of defiance against the erasure of black history. To claim Israelite identity is to resist labels like slave or Negro. It is to reject narratives of inferiority and embrace chosenness instead. No matter how differently groups interpret scripture, this impulse toward resistance unites them. The third is destiny. Whether expressed as quiet hope or loud prophecy, Israelites believe they are part of a divine story that ends in restoration. Some imagine a spiritual revival, others a literal return to the land of Israel, others a cosmic judgment where oppressors fall and God's people rise. However interpreted, the belief in destiny sustains the movement through criticism, division, and struggle. To understand the Black Israelite movement, then, is to understand a chorus of voices, some singing softly, others shouting fiercely, all declaring variations of the same truth: we are Israel. And as the movement continued into the 21st century, this diversity only expanded, shaping how the world would see the Israelites and how they would see themselves. For much of the 20th century, the Black Israelite movement remained largely invisible to the broader public. Its congregations in Harlem, Chicago, Philadelphia, and beyond carried on quietly, shaping identity and faith among their members, but drawing little attention outside their own neighborhoods. That changed dramatically in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Suddenly, Israelites weren't just a hidden current in Black religious life. They were headline news, and the world began to take notice. One of the earliest exposures many Americans had came through encounters on city streets. Israelites in robes, fringes, and headbands, preaching loudly with Bibles in hand, became a recognizable urban image. Videos of these sermons spread across YouTube, then across social media platforms, drawing millions of views. For some, these videos were fascinating windows into a world they had never encountered. For others, they were shocking, confrontational, even frightening. The media often zeroed in on the most radical groups, portraying the entire movement as extreme. Images of fiery preachers declaring judgment on America, denouncing white supremacy, and calling out mainstream religion became shorthand for the Israelites. Rarely did cameras capture the quieter congregations, holding Sabbath services, teaching Hebrew, or raising families rooted in Scripture. As a result, a skewed image dominated public perception. Israelites as street preachers, loud and uncompromising. But the true explosion into public consciousness came through celebrity encounters. In 2019, a viral video showed a group of Israelites at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. during a confrontation involving high school students and Native American elders. The Israelites, though not the center of the incident, were suddenly in headlines worldwide. News anchors and commentators scrambled to explain who they were, often falling back on simplified or negative portrayals. Then came the 2020s. NBA star Kyrie Irving shared a documentary that contained Israelite themes and claims, sparking a firestorm. Critics accused him of promoting harmful stereotypes. Supporters defended his right to explore history. The controversy dominated sports media for weeks, forcing the public to ask questions many had never considered. Who are the Black Israelites? What do they believe? Why does their story matter? Around the same time, Kanye West, now Ye, made comments referencing Israelites in the context of larger controversies about race, religion, and power. Again, the headlines exploded. For some, it was evidence of a dangerous ideology gaining traction. For others, it was a sign that the suppressed story of Israelite identity was finally breaking through to mainstream awareness. These celebrity moments were polarizing, but they were also revealing. They showed how fragile and contested identity remains in America. The very idea that black people could be connected to the ancient Israelites challenged long-held narratives about race, history, and religion. For some, it was empowering. For others, it was threatening. At the same time, pop culture quietly echoed Israelite themes. Musicians referenced biblical exile and return in their lyrics. Filmmakers nodded to ancient connections in subtle ways. Grassroots documentaries gained millions of views online, telling the story of the Israelites from within the community rather than through the lens of outside media. This push and pull between internal self-definition and external portrayal is at the heart of the Israelite experience in the modern age. Inside the community, identity is lived through rituals, through teaching, through family. Outside, identity is debated, framed as controversial, radical, or even dangerous. The truth, of course, is more complicated. The movement is not one thing, but many. Some groups embrace engagement with wider society, while others deliberately separate themselves. Some are moderate and bridge-building, others confrontational and radical. The media spotlight rarely captures this nuance, preferring dramatic images and sound bites. Still, the attention has had undeniable effects. Membership in Israelite groups has grown as curiosity sparks exploration. People who never knew about the movement now research its history, its claims, and its diversity. Some reject it outright, but others find themselves drawn into its orbit, discovering a piece of history that speaks to them on a personal level. The spotlight has also forced Israelites themselves to wrestle with representation. When a radical street preacher goes viral, does he speak for all? When a celebrity makes controversial statements, does it reflect the faith of everyday Israelites, raising children and honoring Sabbath? These questions echo within the movement, shaping internal debates and sometimes fueling divisions. But whether embraced or condemned, the presence of Israelites in mainstream culture is now undeniable. They are no longer hidden in Harlem basements or small synagogues on the edges of town. Their voices are amplified, their claims discussed, their presence acknowledged on a global stage. And as the 21st century unfolds, the question shifts from who are the black Israelites to what role will they play in shaping conversations about race, faith, and history in America and beyond. The Black Israelite movement was never confined to the streets of Harlem or the cities of America. From the very beginning, its message carried a global undertone, that the scattered children of Israel were not just in the United States, but throughout the entire African diaspora, wherever descendants of Africa lived, from Jamaica to London, from Nigeria to Brazil. The claim of Israelite identity resonated like a call waiting to be answered. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Caribbean. In Jamaica, groups began adopting Israelite identity as early as the mid-20th century. They combined it with local traditions, reggae music, and a culture already steeped in biblical symbolism. Here, the Israelite identity often intertwined with Rastafarian ideas, producing unique expressions of faith. Some saw Ethiopia as Zion, others saw the Promised Land as Israel, but the underlying theme was the same. Black people were not lost or cursed, but chosen and connected to ancient prophecy. Across the Caribbean, in places like Trinidad and Barbados, similar movements emerged, often small in number, but powerful in conviction. These groups adapted Israelite teachings to local contexts. The festivals, diets, and rituals of the Hebrew Bible merged with Caribbean rhythms, creating communities that felt both ancient and modern at once. These communities also developed connections with Israelite groups in America, exchanging literature, teachers, and sometimes even members who traveled back and forth. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the idea of Israelite identity began to stir in Africa itself. In Nigeria, the Igbo people long held traditions that some linked to ancient Israel, practices such as circumcision, dietary restrictions, and ritual purity. When Black Israelite teachings reached them, many Igbo believers embraced the identification wholeheartedly, seeing in it confirmation of what their ancestors had always claimed. Synagogues were built, Torah scrolls studied, and prayers lifted in Hebrew. In Ghana, Uganda, and South Africa, similar stirrings could be found. Some groups organized formally into synagogues and associations, while others wove Israelite ideas into broader Christian or Pan-African frameworks. In each case, the claim of Israelite descent served as a tool of empowerment, a way to reclaim dignity after centuries of colonialism, exploitation, and erasure. Europe, too, became fertile ground for Israelite identity. In London, Paris, and Amsterdam, where large African and Caribbean diaspora communities took root, Israelite congregations emerged in the late 20th century. For immigrants facing racism and marginalization, the Israelite message was a spiritual shield. We are not foreigners here. We are Israel, exiled, but destined for restoration. Some groups met quietly, in community centers. Others preached openly in public squares, drawing curious onlookers and occasional controversy. The global spread of the Black Israelite identity was not just about migration or missionizing. It was about recognition. Across the diaspora, scattered communities often found themselves arriving at similar conclusions independently, that their history, their struggles, and their resilience echoed the biblical story of Israel. When they later discovered that others across oceans were making the same claim, it felt less like invention and more like confirmation. Technology accelerated this process. The internet allowed Israelite teachings to circulate globally, with YouTube sermons and online classes reaching audiences from Kingston to Lagos. Diaspora communities that once felt isolated suddenly realized they were part of something vast. In turn, leaders traveled internationally, forging connections, teaching, and strengthening bonds. Conferences and gatherings drew members from multiple continents, transforming the Israelite identity from a local claim to a global movement. But this spread was not without tension. In some cases, Israelite groups in Africa sought formal recognition from the State of Israel, seeking visas, citizenship, or at least acknowledgement. Responses were often mixed, sparking debates about legitimacy and identity. Some were welcomed, while others were denied, revealing the deep complexities of race, religion, and politics. Despite challenges, the global footprint of the Israelites remains undeniable. From reggae songs praising Zion, to Igbo synagogues filled with Hebrew chants, to London street preachers declaring the exile is ending, the claim of Israelite identity reverberates across continents. This global reach reinforces one of the central themes of the movement: exile and return. Just as the ancient Israelites were scattered and later restored, so too the Black Israelites see themselves scattered across the globe, awaiting their collective redemption. Each new community, each new voice claiming Israelite descent, is seen as another piece of prophecy falling into place. What began as a marginalized claim in Harlem has become a worldwide phenomenon, stretching from the Caribbean to Africa, Europe, and beyond. And with each passing decade, the chorus grows louder: we are Israel. From its earliest days, the Black Israelite movement has wrestled with a central challenge: recognition. Who has the authority to declare who is Israel? Who decides what it means to be chosen? These questions have put Israelites at odds with both Judaism and Christianity, creating some of the fiercest debates surrounding their identity. For mainstream Judaism, the Israelite claim raises complex theological and historical issues. On one hand, some Jewish scholars and rabbis acknowledge that scattered communities across Africa may well be linked to ancient Israelite populations. Anthropological studies of groups like the Igbo or Beta Israel in Ethiopia show cultural parallels too strong to ignore. On the other hand, the sweeping claim that all or most descendants of the African diaspora are Israelites is often met with skepticism. Part of this skepticism stems from the standards of Jewish identity itself. Traditional Judaism recognizes matrilineal descent or formal conversion through rabbinical authority. Most Black Israelite groups reject this framework, arguing that history and prophecy, not rabbinical approval, prove their identity. This difference fuels deep tension. To Jewish institutions, many Israelites are outsiders making unverified claims. To Israelites, Jewish resistance is proof of centuries of erasure and exclusion. These tensions sometimes flare into outright hostility. Some radical Israelite groups denounce Jewish communities as imposters, accusing them of stealing Israel's identity. Such rhetoric sparks accusations of anti-Semitism, further widening the gap. At the same time, moderate Israelite congregations often seek dialogue, stressing common faith in Torah and shared struggles of exile. In places like New York and London, quiet collaborations do exist, though they rarely make headlines. Christianity presents a different set of tensions. For centuries, Christianity was the dominant faith in Black communities across the Americas. Israelite teachings, however, often critique Christianity as a distorted religion imposed by colonizers. Many Israelites argue that the New Testament was twisted to justify slavery, colonialism, and oppression. For them, returning to the Torah and reclaiming Israelite identity is a way of breaking free from Christianity's colonial shadow. This critique has led to sharp clashes with Black churches. Pastors often view Israelites as a threat to their congregations, pulling members away with promises of a truer identity. Sermons and debates between pastors and Israelite teachers can be fiery, filled with scripture quoted on both sides. Some churches denounce the movement outright as heretical. Others attempt dialogue, though these conversations are often tense. At the same time, not all Israelites reject Christianity entirely. Some identify strongly with Jesus, or Yahwashi, as the promised Messiah. They reinterpret him not as the founder of a new religion, but as an Israelite leader who came to restore his people. This messianic strand allows for overlap with Christian ideas, though always framed within the Israelite lens. For some Christians, this opens doors to dialogue. For others, it feels like appropriation or distortion. Beyond religion, the question of legitimacy carries political weight. When Israelites claim to be the true descendants of ancient Israel, they challenge centuries of narratives about who belongs in the story of the Bible. For Jewish communities, this feels like an existential threat to their identity. For Christians, it undermines the theological framework that casts the church as the new Israel. For Israelites themselves, the claim is liberating, turning centuries of erasure into affirmation. Academics studying the movement note that these clashes reflect deeper struggles over history and power. The right to define identity is not just a religious matter, but a cultural and political one. To accept the Israelite claim would require rewriting textbooks, rethinking theology, and re-examining centuries of colonial narratives. To reject it, however, risks perpetuating the silencing of Black voices in the story of faith. Within Israelite communities, these tensions are keenly felt. Some members yearn for recognition from Jewish institutions, seeing it as validation of their identity. Others reject the need for external approval altogether, insisting that only God can define who his people are. This divide mirrors the broader spectrum within the movement: moderates seeking bridges and radicals seeking confrontation. The result is an ongoing struggle for legitimacy, one unlikely to be resolved quickly. What is clear, however, is that the question will not go away. With millions now identifying as Israelites worldwide, their presence demands acknowledgement. Whether embraced or opposed, their claim forces Judaism, Christianity, and the wider world to grapple with difficult questions. Who are the true Israelites? What does chosenness mean in a world shaped by race, slavery, and diaspora? For the Black Israelites, the answer is simple: their history, their suffering, and their resilience testify to who they are. For their critics, the answer is far more complicated, and as this debate unfolds, the movement continues to grow, pressing forward with confidence that recognition will come, if not from institutions, then from prophecy itself. The story of the Black Israelites does not end in the past. It is alive today, pulsing in city streets, community centers, family homes, and online platforms across the world. From New York to Lagos, from Kingston to London, Israelites gather every week to pray, study, and declare who they are: the children of Israel, scattered but not forgotten. Their journey from obscurity to global awareness is one of the most striking examples of how identity can endure against overwhelming odds. In America, the movement continues to expand. Street preachers still draw crowds in places like Harlem, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles, their voices amplified by social media. At the same time, quieter congregations flourish, filled with families raising children in Israelite tradition. Hebrew classes, feasts of Passover and tabernacles, and lessons on history anchor the lives of thousands. For many, this isn't just religion, it's a way of reclaiming dignity stolen by slavery and erasure. Globally, the Israelite presence is stronger than ever. In Nigeria, Igbo synagogues swell with worshippers chanting Hebrew prayers. In Jamaica, reggae artists weave Israelite themes into their music, blending scripture with rhythm. In London, young men and women proudly wear fringes on their garments as a statement of identity. Across the internet, live-streamed sermons and digital fellowships connect believers on every continent, shrinking the distance between scattered communities. Yet the legacy is not without controversy. Media portrayals continue to focus on the most radical voices, often ignoring the broader spectrum of belief. Viral videos of confrontations reinforce the stereotype of Israelites as angry outsiders, while quieter communities remain invisible. This imbalance fuels misunderstanding, creating an image that the movement itself struggles to control. Criticism also comes from outside faith traditions. Jewish groups raise concerns about anti-Semitic rhetoric from certain Israelite sects. Christian pastors often denounce Israelite teachings as distortions. Politicians and commentators worry about radicalization. These critiques ensure that the Israelite identity remains polarizing, admired by some, dismissed by others, but never ignored. Inside the movement, debates over legitimacy and practice continue. Some congregations strive for dialogue with Jewish and Christian communities, while others reject any need for outside recognition. Some emphasize prophecy and the coming restoration. Others stress moral reform and community building in the here and now. This diversity can be messy, but it also demonstrates resilience. The Israelites are not one voice but many, united by a shared conviction that they are Israel. And what does that conviction mean today? For many, it means survival. To claim Israelite identity is to reject the narratives of inferiority imposed for centuries. It is to say, we are not lost, we are chosen. It is to root identity, not in trauma alone, but in divine promise. For young people growing up in Israelite homes, it provides a sense of belonging, a heritage to inherit, and a destiny to look toward. It also means resistance. In a world where systemic racism and inequality persist, the Israelite story serves as a constant reminder of endurance and defiance. Just as ancient Israel resisted empires, so too modern Israelites resist the forces that seek to erase or diminish them. Whether through bold preaching or quiet perseverance, they embody a faith that turns survival into testimony. Finally, it means hope. Central to nearly every Israelite group is the belief in restoration. For some, this means a literal return to the land of Israel. For others, it means spiritual renewal, a future where Black people across the diaspora reclaim their history, dignity, and destiny. However defined, the belief in a promised future sustains the movement through opposition and division. The legacy of the Black Israelites, then, is not just about theology or ritual. It is about identity, a claim that defies history, challenges power, and reshapes how we think about belonging. It is about memory, keeping alive stories erased by slavery and colonialism. And it is about prophecy, the belief that the story is not finished, that the scattered will be gathered, that the rejected will be restored. For some, the Black Israelite claim will always be controversial. For others, it will always be empowering. But whether embraced or rejected, ignored or debated, one thing is certain: the Black Israelites have forced the world to confront questions too long buried. Who writes history? Who defines identity? And what happens when those long silenced find their voice again? The story of the Black Israelites is not a closed chapter. It is an unfolding narrative, one still being written in homes, in synagogues, in songs, in sermons, and in the hearts of millions. It is a reminder that the past is never really past. It lives in us, shaping who we are and who we dare to become. And so, the Black Israelites stand as both a mirror and a challenge to the modern world, a people once forgotten, now remembered, declaring their place in the story of Israel and in the story of humanity itself.